Hey internets! First off, for those of you who are looking for something fun to do this summer, next month, specifically Saturday, August 9th at 1 p.m, there is going to be a birthday party for Ron Paul's 90th. And this is actually more than just a birthday party, this is actually kind of a full-blown libertarian convention. And so it's going to have a bunch of special guests, including, of course, Ron Paul himself. So if you're libertarian-minded at all, this is one of those events you definitely want to attend, just for the sake of networking alone. So if this sounds interesting to you, I do recommend signing up sooner rather than later, because the tickets are limited to 500 and they are expecting that they will sell out. And so I will have some links on how you can attend that in the description below. But anyways, today I'm going to be going over the empiricist fallacy. Those of you who are not new to my channel may have noticed that I've mentioned this fallacy before, I've used the term empiricist fallacy before, but until now I have yet to actually really fully explain it. I've yet to actually make a video on it. And so today that shall be remedied. The empiricist fallacy, the simplest way to put it is it's people who make this mistake of thinking, I can't measure X, therefore X either doesn't exist, isn't relevant, or is given some alternative, extremely unlikely, but also very conveniently unfalsifiable explanation. Now, what's very interesting about this fallacy is that it's one of those reasoning errors that even relatively intelligent, relatively well-educated people still tend to fall for, which actually makes this topic slightly less political than some of the other topics I usually cover. So let's just jump into some examples of the empiricist fallacy to see just how common this silliness really gets. Starting with medical science. One very common and unfortunately somewhat tragic way that the empiricist fallacy manifests is in this historical tendency to consider everything that medical science and doctors currently can't explain with kind of psychosomatic explanations, which is basically when they tell the patients that their symptoms are real, but it's effectively all in their head, caused by stress or some kind of forgotten childhood trauma, or caused by anxiety or whatever. And the thing is, and what really makes this dangerous and why so many relatively intelligent people fall for it still, even relatively well-educated people in medical fields fall for it, is that it's technically possible to be true. There is in fact a mind-body connection. Psychosomatic illness is a very real thing. People can absolutely mind screw themselves into believing they have all sorts of disorders that they don't actually have. Like, for example, hypochondriacs, people who effectively just convince themselves that even the tiniest, slightest 1 out of 10 pain symptom that a normal person would just not care about, well, a hypochondriac will convince themselves that that must mean that they are very seriously ill. And so they end up just going to the doctor over and over and over again, when in reality they really do just have anxiety. There's nothing actually seriously wrong with them beyond their own delusions. And this fact, unfortunately, can lead some doctors to assuming that illnesses that we can't fully explain must also have some kind of psychosomatic cause to them. And so the empiricist fallacy has kind of manifested itself in the field of medicine as a sort of psychosomatic of the gaps theory. So if doctors can't explain it, there's a tendency to jump the gun on psychosomatic explanations. And the thing is, there's a lot of illnesses that we now know have very real, very physical, very mechanical causes to them that used to be considered psychosomatic. And based on data and evidence that we have now today, some of these reveal themselves to be pretty darn embarrassing. Like, for instance, diabetes. Yep, before we fully understood insulin and how it works, and how it interacts with glucose and metabolism, etc., there were in fact a lot of doctors who used to think that diabetes was in fact just some psychosomatic illness. They even used to describe something that they would call the diabetic personality type, which again, when we look back on it with today's knowledge, we know that these explanations are pretty darn stupid, actually. They aren't people who just want to be babied by doctors for some silly reason. They are people who are suffering from a very real, very physical illness that prevents their body from correctly utilizing sugar. But of course, that's a case of hindsight being 20/20. Back when we didn't understand insulin, the empiricist fallacy explanation of, oh well, we can't measure X, therefore it is alternative explanation psychosomatic, was a very attractive alternative explanation for doctors who didn't want to admit that they just didn't know what was wrong. Another example of this is peptic ulcers. Yep, we actually used to think that peptic ulcers were largely psychosomatic illness. Again, totally ridiculous by today's understanding. We now know that peptic ulcer is a very real thing. They are generally caused by a bacterial infection or the overuse of certain medications. If you tried to say that this was a psychosomatic illness today, you'd be considered a quack. But back in the day, honestly, even just 50 years ago, the psychosomatic explanation was considered a potentially valid explanation for peptic ulcers. Or another one that you might actually be aware of is epilepsy, which is a particularly interesting interesting one because it's one that both religious leaders and doctors equally got wrong, but for different reasons. Spiritual leaders thought it was from supernatural causes or that they were demonically possessed when having their seizures, and many doctors back in the day before we really started to understand neuroscience thought that it was just all in their head, that it was just caused by anxiety and stress, or that something had traumatized them as a young baby, and that's why they have epilepsy. And of course, today we fully understand that epilepsy is of course caused by abnormal electrical activity in the brain, and we can measure it with things like EEGs and neuroimaging and whatnot. We don't necessarily fully have a good treatment plan on it yet, but we at least now understand epilepsy enough to know that it's not some version of hysteria, or similar ridiculous but also conveniently unfalsifiable explanation. And now, some people might be tempted to look at the past and think, well, yeah, but that was medicine way back in the day. Modern science, we've come a long way. We don't make this mistake anymore. Nowadays, if a doctor suspects something is psychosomatic, they're probably right. And yet, the reality is that is not true either. Just recently, and I mean we're just now figuring this out in the last 4 years or so, a disease known as myalgic encephalomyelitis, sometimes called chronic fatigue syndrome, is in fact not psychosomatic, as previously thought less than a decade ago. So yeah, this is a pretty interesting illness. Apparently people still feel tired no matter how much rest they get, and if they try to push themselves or do things anyways, their disease actually just gets worse and worse. So they feel more and more fatigue, and rest just doesn't help. And scientists are just now discovering that it's actually caused by some kind of post-viral infection that likely triggers some kind of immune response, as well as discovering some physical abnormalities that actually can be measured. And this whole fiasco is really quite fascinating, because it was just recent that a paper was published just in 2023 that debunked the psychosomatic explanation. And apparently there's still a lot of doctors out there that haven't gotten the memo, and so they're still telling patients when they find out that they have this disease that it's just all in their head. And I know I'm kind of explaining all this with a little bit of humor in my tone, but it's really all quite sad. For instance, me personally, some of you may know that I've been chronically ill for a while, and recently I've discovered through spinal imaging that the cause is largely nerve compression. But before I ran into that conclusion, I definitely went through a lot of doctors who were just completely baffled and had no idea what was wrong with me. And of course, one of those doctors gave me the, oh well, what if it's just anxiety explanation? Which, you know, is kind of annoying. I very obviously never saw that doctor again. But that's because I'm aware of this kind of quackery, and I'm aware of the empiricist fallacy and how it works. Not everybody is so lucky. A lot of people really do allow themselves to get completely medically gaslit into believing that the correct treatment for their problem is that they just need to find their inner child and do some upside down underwater yoga to relieve them of their anxiety and their problem will go away. And spoiler alert, a lot of times their problem doesn't go away. And it ends up just being a big fat waste of time. And to some degree, from the doctor's perspective, I can understand why they do this. No doctor wants to be that guy who looks at their patient and just shrugs and has to admit that they don't know. But what I wish more of them understood is that that doesn't mean that the empiricist fallacy is a good idea to fall back on. The correct answer to things you don't know is you don't know. Not, I can't measure your symptoms, therefore they're in your head. And when you look at illnesses like CFSME and see that even today we're still making this mistake, it really shows just how much time is wasted by this kind of nonsense. Another example of it that's kind of tied to the field of medical science, but also kind of gets into philosophy, is the question of consciousness or qualia. Because as some of you may be aware, we are in fact aware of things. You know, that conscious experience of being awake, of being aware of who you are in your surroundings, the sort of user experience of wakefulness, or self-awareness as it's sometimes called. And of course, the thing is, we can't measure it at all, really. In fact, consciousness is a really interesting subject in this topic because as we've come to understand neuroscience more and more, and understand how the brain works more and more, consciousness actually seems to be becoming more and more of a mystery. It's almost as if the root cause of consciousness, or the secret to unlocking it, just gets further and further away the more we chase it. And there have been a variety of explanations for this, such as questioning materialism, for example, but one really interesting explanation of it that some people have given is that, well, maybe consciousness doesn't actually exist. That we've somehow fooled ourselves into believing that we have qualia. No, really, this is an interesting example of the empiricist fallacy, because science still has yet to provide a mechanical explanation for consciousness. There is a huge push in the research to try and explain it away by saying it doesn't actually exist. X cannot be measured, therefore it doesn't exist. And it's silly because that's not an explanation. In fact, in my opinion, probably significantly less likely than any kind of spiritual explanation. And yet, people go for it because for some reason this fallacy is again very attractive even to people who are highly educated. It's very, very easy to convince ourselves that we understand something by simply pretending, oh well, we can't measure it, therefore it's not there. And it's very, very stupid. The correct answer is that we just really don't know. And so you kind of see a pattern in the tragedy of the empiricist fallacy and why so many relatively smart people fall for it. Because a lot of us just don't want to admit that we don't know what we don't know. There's always that lingering temptation to look at things we don't know and to kind of hand wave it away and pretend that we understand it with these kind of half-assed explanations, rather than just swallowing our pride and admitting, hey, we don't know. But honestly, that's not really the worst of the empiricist fallacy. I think the worst cases of empiricist fallacy are when it comes to politics, economics, and incentives. Because any logical, rational person can understand that, yes, incentives are a real thing and you have to consider them, even though they're a little bit difficult to measure. And surprisingly, sadly, there are still a lot of economists, or as I like to call them in this case, economicists, who still just kind of pretend, oh well, we can't measure incentives in this case, so we're just going to do a study where we pretend that they don't exist. Either that, or they do some completely unrelated study and try to draw conclusions about incentives from that study that don't really make any sense when you hold them up to rational scrutiny. And to really understand these problems, you kind of got to get into empiricist epistemology. And that's based on two large assumptions. One is that you can't really know anything about reality for certain a priori without first measuring it. Or in other words, it's an idea that knowledge can really only come from empirical measurement. And while that might at first sound reasonable on the surface, it can very easily be exploited, because it also implies that you can never really know for sure if a piece of evidence really says a certain thing, or if it's because of some kind of unknown variable that you didn't control for. And thus you reach another version of the empiricist fallacy. We didn't measure X, we didn't control for X, therefore X must be due to some kind of alternative but unlikely, but also again conveniently unfalsifiable explanation, which is a tactic that is particularly loved by socialists. Time and time again, countries that try socialism, well, they fail. This is a pretty well-known fact throughout history. So how exactly do socialists reconcile this fact? Country tries socialism, their system results in a major totalitarian state that then collapses. And the answer is they can always attribute it to some kind of unknown but unfalsifiable explanation again. Oh, the reason it failed is because of embargoes, or because of trade deals, or because of not enough foreign aid. Never mind the fact that countries with a more free market system also often face the problems of unfair trade deals and embargoes, and of course other countries getting more aid than them. But it doesn't matter, because through the magic of the empiricist fallacy, unless you were to actually do that experiment, rerunning the socialist country again, this time without those very unlikely explanations, you therefore cannot say that socialism doesn't work. This may sound silly, but it's unironically the type of reasoning that a lot of socialists use. We cannot measure X, therefore this is not relevant to whether or not socialism works. That is unironically how socialists argue. If you ask a socialist why insert socialist experiment here didn't work out, or why it failed, you will be immediately treated to a plethora of excuses piled on top of excuses piled on top of more excuses. And of course none of these excuses have to actually make any sense. It's just that they become unfalsifiable by the magic of the empiricist fallacy. All evidence that the system doesn't work can be considered not relevant as long as they can find some kind of variable. So that's kind of almost the inverse of how the empiricist fallacy works. Like, for example, a really common one is that they'll say that, oh, Venezuela failed because of mismanagement. Maduro failed to oust some of the corrupt elites that were hoarding wealth or something like that. Never mind the fact that the more rational explanation is that people in the government of a socialist dictatorship have no real incentive to not be corrupt, and that this is actually one of the reasons why socialism doesn't work. They'll just kind of completely ignore that kind of common sense in favor of hanging on to the empiricist fallacy. In fact, they'll double down on the empiricist fallacy and say that, oh, incentives? Well, how do you measure the incentives of the elites? You can't prove that those are the incentives that they have. You can't measure the incentives, therefore they don't exist or they're not relevant. And so thus you can really see how the empiricist fallacy can be used to push some seriously intellectually dishonest arguments. We must rerun the socialist experiment where the elites do not become corrupt in order to prove that socialism doesn't work. And if they do become corrupt, we can't prove that it's due to incentives because we can't measure them, therefore they're not relevant. That is pretty much unironically how a lot of tanky arguments go. It sounds so crazy that when I put it this way, you might almost think that I'm strawmanning them, but no, I'm really not. If you Google Soviet Union and state capitalism, you will find that a lot of tankies will actually argue that the Soviet Union was state capitalist because the corrupt elites hoarded the wealth instead of spreading it equally like good little comrades. They just completely ignore the who watches the watcher problem. They're ignoring the fact that one of the key criticisms of a centrally planned economy that tries to be socialist is that you need a watcher making sure that the central planners do not misuse the funds. And that just brings up a question, well, who makes sure that the watcher doesn't also get corrupt? Oh, well, we'll just have another watcher watching the watcher. And how do you prevent that watcher from becoming corrupt? Well, you just have a watcher watching the watcher watching that watcher. You know, turtles all the way down. And so you can really see how they use the empiricist fallacy to just kind of ignore the issue of infinite regression that their system requires. And then lastly, somewhat related to socialists abusing the empiricist fallacy is the empiricist fallacy as it tends to exist within the social sciences. And those of you who watched my video on why a lot of sociology research is basically nonsense may have seen me give this as a basic example. The fallacy generally manifests in the fields of sociology and psychology as, we can't measure X, therefore we're going to pretend that X isn't relevant to our research. So say there's a confounding variable that, from a logical standpoint, should obviously be very relevant to the study that they're conducting. If they can't find a good, simple way to measure it, they'll just pretend that the confounding variable isn't relevant. And then they just kind of, conduct their research anyway and publish their study without that variable accounted for. Just, kind of hoping that nobody notices that their methodology doesn't actually make any sense. Which sounds ridiculous, but the type of reasoning is quite common. Just for fun, let's look at this one from Game Developer. Because, we all know how honest game journos are. Game journos, of course, would never lie and take data out of context. That would just obviously never happen. Anyways, it's just some poorly conducted basic research claiming that women are being discriminated against in the hiring process for game development. And you can see pretty big examples of the empiricist fallacy throughout the reasoning. For instance, a lot of the studies claim that, hey, women make up 50% of gamers. So this therefore proves that there's interest. Well, actually, no, it doesn't, because gamer is a somewhat subjective term. A person who plays Counter-Strike for 20 hours a week and a person who plays some mobile games like Candy Crush are technically both gamers. So it doesn't tell you any difference between what games men and women are playing, and it doesn't really attempt to put any distinction between hardcore or casual gamer. And the thing is, that's because, well, to try and actually define these things is honestly kind of difficult. It's obvious when you think about it what the difference is between a casual or hardcore gamer, but if you ask 10 different gamers, you'll still get 10 different responses. So what do in studies like this? Well, X is difficult to measure, so we're just going to pretend like it's not relevant. They just ignore the distinction entirely, and then they just kind of hope that nobody notices that this completely kills the reasoning of their argument. And it's also a really good example of how the empiricist fallacy can be mixed with the equity fallacy, assuming that unequal outcomes are due to discrimination. We cannot measure variable X, therefore variable X is not relevant, and from that they deduce the cause of whatever they're complaining about must be due to some kind of mysterious, unfalsifiable force of discrimination. Like for instance asking, well, why are only around 5% of video programmers female? Just completely, ignoring any kind of possible differences between men and women that make men and women value different things and have different incentives. But again, because those things are difficult to measure, they pretend like they don't exist. And of course, they ask more stupid questions. If women enjoy playing games as much as men, why don't they represent more of the workforce making them? Again, playing games doesn't imply the same amount of interest in those games. And of course, game development is a completely different story. 100% of people who play games don't necessarily want to get into the things that involve making games, especially when they discover, what making games actually entails. It's a completely different skill set than playing games. But what's really weird is the counter-argument this article tries to make, or really just lack thereof a counter-argument. It simply points to the fact that the number of women getting computer science degrees was rising and then suddenly stopped. And therefore, it's discrimination, because computers and gaming was marketed towards men. But that's entirely a circular argument. They're just assuming it was marketed towards men out of some kind of nefarious plot to keep women out, and not because boys just showed more interest in gaming in order to prove their own assumption. But of course, that difference in level of interest between the sexes is difficult to measure, so again, the magic of empiricist fallacy comes in and swoops in to save the day and save their bad reasoning through the magic of, we can't measure this difference, therefore it must not be relevant. Which in this particular example is actually pretty darn pathetic, because if they really wanted to, they actually could measure the difference. They could at the very least survey the difference between what games men and women play and how often they play them, and to what degree of casual or hardcore do they play them. Then of course further survey them based on interest in whether or not they want to get into game development. And while self-reported data is admittedly not without its own faults, it's better than nothing. It's better than the total laziness that they've done here, which is just, oh well, this is too difficult to measure, we're not going to put the effort into measuring it, so we're just going to pretend it's irrelevant. Which is why so many of these kind of studies tend to have kind of a far left bias to them. As I pointed out in that video on sociology, the worse of a job you do in controlling for confounding variables, the more likely you will find large disparities, which then allows a far lefty to point at those disparities and just scream "ma discrimination." That's pretty much how the perpetuation of the far left bias within the social sciences works. Which then brings me to the last part of this video, the conclusion, which is really just the consequences of the empiricist fallacy. Because aside from just progressive pseudoscience, there's a lot of other problems. The main one being is that when the empiricist fallacy is used to justify a bad take, what ultimately happens is that any kind of additional investigation to discover what the truth might be, it just doesn't get done. Like for instance, going back into the issue of medical science and calling everything that certain doctors can't find an immediate explanation for psychosomatic. What happens is that when you have the psychosomatic explanation and you come up with these psychosomatic treatments that don't actually work, well, what happens is those treatments end up delaying any kind of real treatment. They end up not doing any kind of research to find out what the real cause of the symptom is because they've convinced themselves that they already have a treatment. It's psychosomatic. So they just, need to just do more underwater upside down yoga. I mean, I'm of course exaggerating. What really happens is that they just tell the patients that they need to go see a psychiatrist. But you get the idea. It's used to justify not funding research into discovering the actual root cause of the problem. For instance, going back to CFS-ME, the only reason apparently that we've recently discovered that it's not psychosomatic is actually because of COVID. Apparently a bunch of long COVID sufferers also ended up coming up with CFS-ME, which caused more people to kind of question, okay, well, that's a little bit weird. Why is it after COVID we're suddenly getting all these people with ME? And so more and more people started questioning the psychosomatic explanation, thus resulting in more research being done, thus resulting in us now finding out, oh, whoopsies, the psychosomatic explanation is a load of bull. So that's just kind of your run-of-the-mill practical problem with the empiricist fallacy, is that they convince themselves that they know the real reason for a problem when in reality they have no clue. They should have just admitted, okay, we don't know what's causing these symptoms, so we need to do more research, we need to investigate more. But because they instead went, oh well, we can't measure this, therefore alternative explanation psychosomatic, because of, that, people just don't really look further into things. People convince themselves that we have an explanation, therefore no further explanation is needed. Because the unfortunate thing is a lot of times very educated people can also be a little bit conceited. They don't want to admit when they're wrong, and so these half-arsed wrong explanations that they come up with based on the empiricist fallacy end up getting really sticky because nobody wants to admit they're wrong. And you can actually see this problem in doctor behavior. A lot of times when psychosomatic anxiety explanations for an illness get proven wrong, it's not uncommon to see doctors still trying to treat it that way even a full decade or so after it's been disproven. And then on the economic side of things, well, it's kind of obvious. People still think in the year 2025 that socialism can work if we just account for that one unfalsifiable explanation that we obviously didn't really pay any attention to and obviously aren't actually giving any kind of honest reasoning to, but we're going to pretend that because we haven't measured that one difference, then we cannot for sure say that socialism doesn't work, even though the alternative explanations are very unlikely. And then of course there's just the mountains and mountains of bad economic research that comes from just totally ignoring differences in people's incentives, even though it's very, very painfully obvious that incentives exist. Like for example, if you're hungry, then you obviously have an incentive to buy food. So of course incentives exist. Human action is a very real thing, which of course is very easy to understand when I give the food example, but surprisingly there's a lot of economics research out there that ignores slightly less obvious versions. It's very easy for a researcher who doesn't want to admit that they don't actually understand something or they can't figure something out. It's easy for them to just kind of fall back on the empiricist fallacy when doing that kind of research. Oh well, we can't measure any kind of difference in incentives, or it's too difficult to measure the thoughts in people's heads, so we're just going to pretend that those thoughts don't exist. It's all very incredibly stupid, and sometimes it's really just the result of bad faith, but a lot of times it's just genuinely people who don't want to admit that they're probably wrong and they don't really know what's going on. And so that's all I have to say on the subject. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe and all that good stuff, especially comments in regards to examples of the empiricist fallacy that you've seen, because I know there's a lot more examples out there that I could have gone over in this video, but for the sake of keeping things a little bit shorter than usual, decided not to go there. And also for those of you who really like my content, you can support me on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or just by buying some merch. And lastly, again, don't forget to check out that Ron Paul birthday party. That is all. Till next time.